Paul is a Jew, remember. He's a converted Jew. He's a Christian and a Jew. And he doesn't exclude himself from all these things he's writing. He's included as a model Christian. I, Paul, a Jew, say, as long as the heir is a child, he does not differ at all from a slave. Then he says, we, all of us, in verse 3, we, Jews and everybody else, while we were children, were held in bondage under the elemental stihia. That would be the demonic forces that control the universe right now. We were in the grip. We, Paul, including Paul, were under demonic influences. That's very, very significant. Until then, when the fullness of time came, there's an until, there's an end of that period, God sent forth on a commission his son Jesus, who was born of a woman. Most interesting there, not just born of a woman, but came into existence from a woman. Torah keeping is fine, provided you get the right Torah. The whole Bible is about obedience. That's the key to everything. Mankind is commanded to obey God, but it depends on what covenant you're talking about. So we'll divert to that little point. We are now in the new covenant. Paul said that Paul, was a minister of the new covenant, which is both renewed and new. It's brand new in one sense. It's also a renewal of the Abrahamic covenant. Both things. We are now in it. There are people saying out there, you can't be in the new covenant until the second coming. That is absolutely false. But it's like saying you can't be born again as a son until the resurrection. That is also false. You have to be born again now. You have to have moved into the new covenant. They say, in Jeremiah 30:31, it says, I, in the future tense, God speaking, will make a new covenant with Israel and Judah. That's true. That's not to the exclusion, though, of the fact that we are in advance of that. We are the Israel of God now, the true people of God, international church. And with us, then, that new covenant has been made. That's absolutely clear. If you don't believe that, you're throwing away your own identity, which is, you don't know who you are. Then that's a form of dementia. You must know who you are. And you are then a child, not just an adopted son. That's a false translation. Adoption is wonderful, but it's a little bit more, it's less direct than having a real son. So, sonship is what's meant here. You are genuine sons of God by being born again, and guess where that rebirth comes from? It comes from the seed, the spora or sperma, the Greek word, and guess where that sperma and spora comes from? The gospel of the kingdom.
Is Paul here saying that the Torah of Moses now is part of the empty human tradition, even as you put it earlier, demonic things of this present evil age?
Very clever. If you're the devil, you do that. You say, look at this Bible here. The devil is using Moses, who's perfectly valid at his own time, and then turning that into something that Christians should now be subject to. And Paul says, you want to go into bondage? Go there. I don't recommend it. You want to get physically circumcised? I don't recommend it, because you'll have to keep the whole law. Well, it's clear you had to keep the whole law in the Old Testament times. Physical circumcision, you've used this word, was the gateway to the faith. Without that, you're going nowhere. That's both Jew and Gentile, by the way. If you wanted to be truly part of the covenant in the Old Covenant times, you had to be physically circumcised. That's absolutely clear. And Paul is saying the exact opposite here. He's saying, do not be physically circumcised. If you do, you're going to have to keep the whole of that Mosaic law. Don't go there.
And now that belongs to the demonic, elemental, empty philosophy of the world. Can I just read this couple of verses in your paraphrase?
Okay.
Colossians 2:8 and 9.
Yes.
Be extremely careful that no one takes you captive with philosophy, empty deceit, based on human tradition, based on the elemental forces of the world, not in harmony with Messiah. Verse 9, for in Messiah, the entire fullness of God, the embodily form, dwells. And you have been filled by him, Messiah, who is the head over every ruler and authority. And then later in this chapter, in verses 16 and 17, for good measure, Paul, the Pharisee, former Pharisee, throws in the Jewish calendar.
Yes.
What's called the trio of Sabbath, new moons, and festival.
One shadow.
And now he says, in my discussion here about the elemental things of this world, human-made things that have no value. Yes. Now, guess what? Now, this also now has no value. Is that
of course, absolutely. He's warning you, don't keep the Jewish calendar. The logic of all this in Colossians 2:16, that's well put. I thought you expounded that well. In Colossians 2:16, it says, do not let anybody, whoever it is, tell you what to do in terms of food and drink. It's a non-issue. In terms of the Sabbath, which is part of the trio. So you have three items here. The holy days, those are the annual festivals. The new moons, those are the first of every month celebrations. And the weekly Sabbath. A technical point here, that's singular in meaning, Sabbath, not Sabbath days, plural. There's a technical point in the language there. Maybe I don't need to add that to our discussion, maybe I do, but the Seventh-day Adventists said that third item there is Sabbath days. And they said, there you go, that's holy days, not the weekly Sabbath. So on that blunder, they saved the weekly Sabbath and insisted on keeping that, as they do to this day. But that would be very illogical for Paul to say, I'm warning you again against three things: the holy days, the new moons, and the holy days. That would be A, B, A. That is very, very poor logic, to speak politely about it. So the whole calendar, if you insist then on keeping the holy days, you must keep the new moons. In Paul's mind, they are equal status entirely, as are distinctions between foods, because in Romans, Paul said, I, who is a Jew, I'm a Jew, I'm a converted Christian, and I'm convinced that nothing in the way of food is unclean of itself. Oh, people say that's not right because pork is not food. They're misunderstanding the reason of the food laws. Even the rabbis say it's nothing to do whether it's good food for you. It's to learn to distinguish between good and evil that you do that food distinction. It's not a health issue at all. And in the New Covenant, you don't need that distinction at all. Everybody's equal before God.
Because what we're saying here about God's law that he gave to Moses. I mean, I was a former agnostic. You're a former Sabbatarian.
Yes, we were.
I fear almost for it if I didn't believe it. In other words, if I'm wrong, because the way Paul portrays now the much beloved divine, the glory that was from Mount Sinai. I mean, we better be.
Well, Paul, I don't think could have been clearer than he is. He says, if you go back under that old covenant law, you are giving up Christ. You can make your choice. You either have Christ or you have the Old Testament law. You can't have both. If you want to be a slave, go for it. If you want to be in bondage, go for it. But I recommend you go for freedom. And he does endless comparisons. It's like marriage, for instance. When people die, that marriage is finished. I don't know how Paul could have made this clearer. He's warning you with all the techniques of literary art against making the mistake of trying to keep the Sabbath on Saturday, or the holy days, or the new moons. Don't do it, because they are a shadow of what was to come, and that's the correct translation. They're a shadow of what was to come.
How can you go back to those useless, worthless rules?
Yes.
He's talking about the Torah of Moses.
Of course he is. Which was the schoolmaster until. It's an added law. So until you understand there are two forms of law here. There's the permanent law of God, which is overarching for everything. And then there's this added law 450 years later than Abraham, right? The Abrahamic covenant is still binding. That's why Abraham believed God before he got circumcised. Remember the story? It's very cleverly done. Before circumcision got in there, physical circumcision, which was for everybody without distinction at that time, before that, Abraham believed God and it was counted as making him right. And that then was the text I started with last week, Romans 4:13, the promise to Abraham that he would be heir of the world. How would you like to rule the world with Messiah? The promise to Abraham. You are Abraham's children spiritually. But that preceded circumcision in the flesh. That was added. And it was part of that added law which came to an end 430 years later with Jesus. So if you say, oh, I've got to have my children circumcised, especially if you're a Jew, you're going to say, I want to do that, don't do it. Because you're denying the cross. Here's the parallel that Paul keeps making. Jesus died for your sins. The curse of the law, it was nailed to the cross. Don't go there. You don't need that.
The fact that he's speaking both to Gentiles,
yes,
non-Jews, and Jews
yes,
here. Mayers has a good comment on verse 3. The we there.
Yes, he means you. We.
Embraces Christians generally, says Mayers, the Jewish and Gentile Christians together.
Yes. So that's a good, I like that comment.
Important.
Paul is writing to Jews and to Gentiles.
Christians.
Yes.
They're all Christians.
Yes. So also we, Jews and Gentiles together, while we were children, were held in bondage under the elemental things of the world. It didn't matter whether we were pagans before or Jews, it was all temporary.